Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, you're of course known nationally and internationally as one of the leading American imams among the Muslim community, very well known in America itself. So what is American identity to you? How would you define it?
I don't think you could come to any one definition. I mean, lack of definition of what an American is in some ways the definition. It's e pluribus unum, out of many, one. So it's obviously, if anything could be said, I think, about being an American is the possibility of what it means to be an American. So it's probably the single most meritocratic culture in the world today, and I think Obama is a good example that still is very much part of the American experience, the possibility, which is not the case in many, as you know, and anybody that's lived in other parts of the world. I mean, a lot of Americans don't realize how fortunate they are to be in a culture that allows the possibility to come from an inner city like Dr. Sherman Jackson and end up being a very well-respected professor at a major American university. So to come from the humblest of backgrounds and have that, but for the sky there are no fences facing, like one of the 60s troubadours said.
So it's a land of opportunity, but in terms of definitions itself, how would you define it? How would you explain this society?
Well, if you want to ask what America is, yeah, I mean, if you're asking what an American is, that to me that's very difficult to define that. If you're asking what America is I mean, obviously we could talk about many different definitions, but ultimately America is an experiment. It's called the New World because it was an attempt to break from the past, and the Founding Fathers saw themselves vis-a-vis old Europe and also the Ottomans, because they mentioned the Ottomans in the Federalist Papers several times, and the despotism of the East, the political decadence of Europe was something that they were really trying to avoid. Tyranny, the idea of the possibility of having a country where religion was not something that was forced upon people, but it was something that people could choose for themselves. So religious tolerance is rooted in that. Freedom of speech, which is really the freedom to criticize your politicians. I don't think they envision the type of definitions like pornography and things like that have been since introduced into it. But America is definitely rooted in the idea of the right to assemble and freedom of speech, articulated profoundly in the Bill of Rights. And then it's also a place where I think the idea that you could have a government that was that served the people and was not a government that made the people servants. So the idea of real citizenry and enfranchisement, and obviously it's been a process. When they started, women were not part of that story, blacks were not part of that story, even the Irish were not part of that story. So it's been a process, but the founding principles, and that's what's, I think, deeply extraordinary about the American experiment, is that the founding principles so perfectly articulated certain things that still ring universally true. That there's something that is perennial about the truths that they articulated, and it's certainly, I think, for me, the political ideals of America have completely changed the world. I mean, there's no doubt about that. And even the Iranian constitution is, despite the fact that it arises out of an Islamic ethos, is nonetheless very much influenced by the American Constitution. So even in an Islamic society that's trying to formulate an Islamic state, they're relying on tools from the American experience.
And what is the landing of the Mayflower, Plymouth Rock Plymouth? What does all that mean?
Well, I mean, this part of like cosmology, it's like myths, you know, creation myths. I mean, it's part of the creation myth of America. The idea of the Pilgrims leaving Europe behind in search of religious freedom, the right to, because they were being persecuted in England, and England was probably one of the far more lenient states in Europe at the time. But despite that, there was persecution, and so coming to America, coming to the new land, was part of that. The Catholics also that were being persecuted in Protestant countries. Maryland is the land of Mary. It was a place where Catholics, and that's really where the religious tolerance comes, out of Virginia and Maryland. And certainly what's interesting is that in some ways it wasn't that they didn't want a state devoid of religion, but they did not want any one religion to dominate the state. So I think the Mayflower, Plymouth Rock, these are part of the story, the enduring story of America.
And
although Malcolm X said, you know, I didn't land on Plymouth Rock landed on me. So there's also alternative narratives going on at the same time. I mean, that's a dominant narrative, but there are other narratives that were happening at the same time. The Native Americans view the landing on Plymouth Rock as something very different. Many Native Americans, I mean, I have a friend, Chief Arvil Looking Horse, who's a Lakota chief, who sees that very differently. So, you know, fighting domestic terrorism for 500 years, that's the way some Americans, Indians, Native Americans view the whole process. So there are alternative narratives, and one of the exciting aspects of modern America is that these alternative narratives are gaining strength, and these voices are beginning to be articulated, and the dominant narrative of American mythology has been really challenged and in many ways eroded. So that while those things are still important, I think a lot of people do not accept them in the ways that they were accepted by the Norman Rockwell version of America, which is a very whitewashed version of America, and that's being true to ourselves. You know, Jung talks about embracing the shadow. For America to live in that kind of denial about the atrocities and those dark aspects of our culture and our history is to deny people the possibility of transcending them. You live in a melodramatic universe of comic book heroes and villains.
And the Muslim experience itself, especially after 9/11, does that in some senses challenge some of the central features that you're referring to in terms of human rights, civil liberties, the notion of torture and so on? Would you say that those are, in fact, the notion of pluralism, are these challenged by the reality of the Muslim experience?
Well, I think in a lot of ways the Muslim experience is challenging America, just like many immigrant experiences have in the past. The Asian experience, the Chinese coolies that built the railroads, that were treated terribly, the Japanese internment, particularly in California. I mean, other Japanese Americans were not interned, but in California they were. The Mexican American enfranchisement that's really still in that, it's a process, so it's not fully, we're not fully there. African American, there's all these different peoples out there that have struggled. And Irish, I mean, people don't talk about the Irish American struggle, the struggle for Irish not only to become white, but to become fully enfranchised Americans, and that doesn't really happen until Kennedy is elected president. Irish couldn't be in country clubs, they couldn't marry Anglo-Saxon women. You know, people, if they really read the history, they'll recognize that racism in this country has not been about color solely. It's been about other things as well. So the Muslims are challenging that again, and it's good that they're doing it, and it's also good for the Muslims because resistance is what makes you stronger. If you want to build your muscles, you have to have resistance. When there's no resistance, there's nothing gained. So I don't see this as necessarily a negative thing. It's a challenge. But obviously there are certain aspects to the post 9/11 world, in America in particular, that have challenged this country to the core. I don't have any illusions about the fact that torture has been used. The CIA has used torture. There's untold amounts of documentation. This country has trained people in South America in torture and things like this, but nobody has ever justified it legally. It's always been black operations and something. It's just in the kind of corners and recesses that nobody wants to talk about. I think what 9/11 did is it brought it out into the open, which was quite shocking for a lot of Americans. But again, in some ways, it's good. I think Abu Ghraib was an opportunity for us to take a look at ourselves, because Abu Ghraib is not an anomaly. There have been many Abu Ghraibs in American history. The suffragettes were tortured. A lot of people don't know that suffragettes that were arrested and taken to jails and tortured, quite literally. This is all documented American history. So, but the idea of legitimizing this through law, the choosing of Guantanamo as a base outside of American jurisdiction, these type of things, extraordinary rendition, the idea of seizing people without writ habeas corpus. I mean, these things are they're medieval. The Magna Carta is this is something I think for people that studied civics and took all this stuff seriously. I think it's shocking for a lot of Americans who are just uneducated and basically semi-literate people. I don't think these things are major challenges to them because they don't really know their own history. They don't know what this country's about. I mean, you teach at the university. I'm shocked at the levels of ignorance that we have about our own history.
Ignorance, and I think they're predisposed to also believing that these measures are somehow justifiable because America is threatened. It is still under a cloud of the possible attack from the Muslim world, or maybe even Muslims inside America. You have this constant media.
And that's fine for common people, but that's not acceptable for a Justice Department to debate these things, because these things have been debated for a long time, and decisions were made a long time ago about human dignity. Even during the height of the Cold War, Russians were not tortured, even though we were, the nuclear threat was much greater then. Also during the Nazi period, these things were not.
So why now?
Well, I think partly race is an element. The Arabs, Noam Chomsky has said that, racism towards Arabs is kind of the last acceptable bastion of racism. Nobody seems to really care much about the Arabs. And I think that goes for Muslims in general, because Muslims have been demonized. Our history is a history of a 1,000-year war with Islam. I mean, we tend to forget that the West, one of the things about Europe, and I think Pope Benedict XVI, I think he articulated this very well when he gave his speech in Germany about quoting the Byzantine emperor, because what he was what he was essentially saying is that Europe has two identities, and we tend to forget that. The first identity is what it is. It's a Christian country, a Christian continent. The second identity is what it's not. So it has a positive identity and a negative identity. The negative identity is that it's not Muslim. And in many ways, the negative identity has had more to do with the formation of Europe than the positive identity. The Holy Roman Empire was a failure. But what really unified Europe was the challenge and threat